In the peaceful village of Everbrook, nestled in a valley, surrounded by gently rolling hills and towering, snow-capped mountains, life moved at a steady pace. The sun rose each day over the village square, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. The air was always filled with the scent of blooming flowers, with colorful flower boxes hanging from every window. Stone cottages lined the street, each covered in ivy, their walls weathered by the passing of time. A small brook ran through the village, its waters clear and sparkling, gently babbling as it passed beneath old wooden bridges. Among the village's inhabitants was a curious young boy named Thomas. His bright blue eyes always seemed to be searching for something, and his unruly brown hair was a testament to his constant adventures. He had a small wooden flute that he carried with him wherever he went, playing tunes inspired by the world around him. Despite the charm of Everbrook, Thomas felt an unshakable sense that there was something more out there, beyond the hills and forests. At night, as the village fell asleep, he would often stare out at the dark outline of the forest, wondering what mysteries it held. One stormy evening, as the wind howled outside, the villagers gathered around the warmth of Nana Mabel's hearth. The fire crackled and flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of her cottage. The heavy rain drummed against the roof, but inside the air was thick with the sense of anticipation. The children huddled close, eager to hear Nana Mabel's latest story. With a knowing smile, Nana Mabel began. "In the heart of the forest," she said, her voice steady and calm, "there lies a mirror unlike any other. It reflects not just your image, but your truest self, your desires, your fears, your innermost thoughts." The children fell silent, hanging on her every word. "Many have sought it, but none have returned unchanged," she continued, her silver hair glowing in the firelight. "The forest itself tests those who enter. Only the purest of heart may reach the mirror and gaze upon their truth." Thomas, sitting in the front, felt a chill run down his spine. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, but in the room there was an eerie stillness. His heart raced as he thought about the mirror. Could it really show him the answers to the questions that haunted him? Could it reveal his true self? Later that night, Thomas lay in his small bed, the sound of the rain still tapping against the window. The flickering lantern beside him cast soft shadows on the walls, and he stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. His mind kept returning to Nana Mabel's words about the enchanted mirror. What would it be like to see his heart laid bare? What truth would he find there? He held his flute tightly in his hands, the familiar smoothness of the wood offering him some comfort. For as long as he could remember, playing the flute had been a way to escape, to let his emotions flow in a way words never could. But tonight, even the music seemed distant. The desire to find the mirror filled him entirely. "If only I could find it," he whispered into the quiet night. The storm outside raged on, and the wind howled through the trees, but Thomas's mind was made up. He needed to find that mirror. It was the only way he could understand himself, understand his place in the world. He could feel the call of the forest, drawing him in, and he knew he had to answer. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village sparkling in the soft light of the early sun. The sea was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of new beginnings. The streets of Everbrook seemed calm and ordinary, but for Thomas, the world had shifted. He stood at the edge of the village, looking out toward the dense forest that lay beyond. He had packed a small satchel with provisions, his flute tucked safely by his side. The villagers, seeing his preparations, offered words of concern, but Thomas's resolve was unshakable. His bright blue eyes, usually filled with curiosity, now gleamed with purpose. He turned to face the forest, its shadows stretching long across the valley. The trees seemed to beckon him, their branches swaying as though whispering secrets only he could hear. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped forward, his feet moving steadily, despite the uncertainty that churned in his chest. He was leaving everything he had known behind, but something deep inside told him that this journey was the path he was meant to take. As Thomas entered the forest, he felt the world around him change. The air grew cooler, the sounds of the village fading into the distance, as the thick canopy above blocked out the sunlight. The forest was alive, the rustling leaves, the chirping of birds, and the distant rush of water all creating a symphony of nature's voices. Each step seemed to take him deeper into the heart of the world, and yet the trees felt strangely welcoming, as if they had been waiting for him all along. Thomas paused to take in the scene. The forest was like a different world, full of strange, mystical beauty. The moss-covered ground was soft beneath his boots, and the tall trees stood like ancient guardians, their trunks twisted and gnarled. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the ground. It was peaceful, yet there was an unmistakable energy in the air, a sense of something more, something hidden. He couldn't help but feel small in the face of it all. But the excitement bubbling in his chest drowned out the fear. This was what he had been searching for. He had stepped into the unknown, and he wasn't turning back. As Thomas ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the world around him began to shift. The chirping of the birds was replaced by the gentle murmur of a river. The water sparkled in the soft light that filtered through the trees, its surface shimmering like a sheet of glass. Thomas followed the sound of the water, curious to see where it would lead. Soon he came upon a sparkling stream, its crystal clear waters winding lazily through the underbrush. Thomas knelt at the edge, his fingers dipping into the cool water. The river's flow felt smooth against his skin, but as he watched, the water began to shimmer and ripple. To his astonishment, the water shaped itself into a face that seemed to form from the very current itself. The face smiled, and its voice echoed in Thomas's mind. "Traveler," it spoke in a melodic, flowing tone. "Why do you seek the mirror?" Thomas pulled his hand back, startled, but he quickly regained his composure. The river's face seemed to radiate wisdom, and despite its ethereal nature, Thomas didn't feel afraid. The question it posed echoed in his mind, and he found himself speaking without hesitation. "I seek the mirror to find my true self," he said quietly, feeling the weight of the words as they left his lips. The river's face seemed to nod in approval, and it let out a soft chuckle. "Then you must prove your sincerity," it replied. "Follow my course and I shall guide you." The river's surface rippled again, and glowing patterns began to form in the water, outlining a path that led downstream. Without thinking, Thomas stood and began to follow the shimmering trail, his heart beating faster with anticipation. The path ahead seemed to hold the promise of discovery, and he felt a deep sense of purpose growing inside him. As the river's path led Thomas deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and the shadows more pronounced. The sunlight, once filtering through the branches above, now struggled to break through the dense foliage, casting the world into a dim twilight. Eventually, Thomas arrived at a rickety wooden bridge that spanned a deep ravine. The bridge swayed in the breeze, its planks creaking under the slightest movement. Beneath it, the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as though something was lurking in the depths below. Thomas hesitated at the edge of the bridge, staring down into the darkness. The shadows whispered his name, faint voices rising from the depths. They were soft at first, but as the wind picked up, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. His heart raced in his chest, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Was this truly the right path? What if the bridge was a trap? Or worse, something worse lay waiting on the other side. But then, as if sensing his hesitation, a gust of wind rustled through the trees, and Thomas steadied his resolve. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the straps of his satchel. "I have come this far," he whispered to himself. "I cannot turn back now." With that, he stepped forward onto the creaking bridge, each step echoing in the silence. The shadows seemed to grow darker around him, but he focused on the path ahead, the steady rhythm of his breath grounding him. Slowly but surely, he made his way across the ravine, his determination burning brighter with every step. When Thomas reached the other side of the bridge, he found himself in a moonlit clearing. The night was still, and the air was cool and crisp. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the trees around him. At the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like the fingers of some ancient. Perched on one of the lower branches was a majestic owl, its silver feathers gleaming in the moonlight. The owl's golden eyes fixed on Thomas as he approached, its gaze sharp and knowing. It tilted its head slightly, regarding him with an expression that seemed almost human. "Who dares disturb the forest's secrets?" it asked, its voice low and steady, like the deep rumble of thunder in the distance. Thomas stood tall, despite the awe that filled him. He had heard of the wise creatures of the forest, but he hadn't expected to encounter one so soon. "I seek the mirror," he said, his voice steady. "To understand my heart." The owl seemed to consider his words for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Wisdom is not something that can be gained without patience and courage," the owl said. "You have come this far, but remember, the journey is as important as the destination. Keep your heart open and your mind clear." With that, the owl spread its wings and flew into the night, leaving Thomas standing alone in the clearing. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the owl's words settle over him. He was no longer just searching for the mirror, he was searching for himself. Thomas continued on his path, each step bringing him deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, and the air seemed thick with magic. Soon he found himself standing before a magnificent tree. Its bark was silver, and its leaves shimmered with a soft, golden light, casting a warm glow across the forest floor. Beneath the tree, a girl about Thomas's age stood. Her hair, long and golden, cascaded down her back in braids that glowed softly in the light. She was dressed in a simple dress, adorned with tiny flowers, and carried a woven basket in her hands. When she saw Thomas, she smiled warmly, her blue eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Are you here for the leaves?" she asked, her voice gentle and melodic. Thomas nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of peace in her presence. Together they began to gather the glowing leaves, their fingers brushing as they worked side by side. The girl shared stories of her own journey, of the wonders of the forest and the creatures she had met. As they worked, Thomas realized that, for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt a connection to this girl, to the forest, and to something larger than himself. The golden light of the tree bathed them both in warmth, and for a brief moment, Thomas allowed himself to relax. He was not just seeking the mirror, he was beginning to understand that the journey itself was what truly mattered. As they worked together, the golden leaves fluttered gently from the tree, their soft glow bright against the deep green of the forest. Thomas marveled at the beauty of the tree, its light seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The girl moved with grace, her delicate hands gathering the leaves with a practiced ease. Thomas followed her lead, carefully plucking the glowing leaves and placing them in the woven basket she carried. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the soft rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. Thomas felt as though time had slowed, the moment stretching into something timeless and serene. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. There were no questions, no uncertainties, just the simple act of being present in this moment. As they worked, the girl spoke of the tree's significance, telling Thomas that it had stood in the forest for centuries. "Its light is a gift," she said softly, "a symbol of hope for those who are willing to seek it. The forest is full of wisdom, but only those who are patient enough to listen can hear its secrets." He wasn't just gathering leaves, he was gathering pieces of something far greater, something that would guide him on the rest of his journey. The forest was speaking to him in ways he had never imagined, and with each leaf he collected, he felt more connected to the world around him. After they had gathered a generous number of glowing leaves, Thomas and the girl continued along the forest path. The trees around them seemed to grow even more ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching high into the sky. The air was thick with magic, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with an energy Thomas could almost feel in his bones. Suddenly, a rustle in the underbrush drew their attention. From the shadows, a fox appeared, its sleek, red fur gleaming in the soft light of the forest. The fox's eyes were sharp and mischievous, its gaze both playful and calculating. It lounged on a mossy rock, its tail flicking back and forth lazily as it studied Thomas and the girl. "To pass, you must solve my riddle," the fox declared in a voice that was both teasing and serious. "Only then will you be allowed to continue on your journey." Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He had heard of trickster creatures in the forest, but he had never encountered one before. The girl smiled knowingly, stepping back to give him space. "It's a test of wit," she said softly. "Answer wisely, and you'll be allowed to pass." The fox's eyes gleamed as it spoke. "I have cities but no houses. I have forests but no trees. I have rivers but no water. What am I?" Thomas thought carefully, his brow furrowing as he considered the riddle. The words twisted in his mind, each clue leading him further into thought. The girl watched him quietly, her expression calm but encouraging. After a moment of contemplation, Thomas's face lit up with realization. "A map," he exclaimed. The fox grinned widely, clearly impressed by his quick thinking. "Correct," the fox said, its voice filled with approval. "You may pass, but remember, the forest holds many secrets. Use your mind as well as your heart." With a flick of its tail, the fox vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the soft rustling of leaves. Thomas and the girl continued on their path, the sense of accomplishment from solving the riddle, filling Thomas with a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead was still and quiet, but the air was thick with the weight of the riddle that had been posed to Thomas. As they walked, the words echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. The map. It seemed so simple now, but it had taken him a moment to piece it all together. As they moved through the dense forest, Thomas found himself deep in thought. What other challenges awaited him? What other tests would he face on his journey to the enchanted mirror? The fox had spoken of wisdom and courage, but Thomas felt as though the forest was speaking to him in more subtle ways. The girl beside him seemed to sense his thoughts. "The forest speaks in riddles," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the answers are always there, waiting for those who are willing to listen." Thomas nodded, grateful for her wisdom. He hadn't realized how much he had to learn, not just about the forest, but about himself. The journey ahead would require more than just courage. It would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. After passing the fox, Thomas and the girl ventured deeper into the heart of the forest. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around them, as if they were being swallowed by the forest itself. The air grew thick with mist, and the ground became slick with dew. Eventually, they came upon a clearing, but what lay before them was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. The ground was covered in smooth stone tiles, and towering mirrors rose up from the earth, their silver frames gleaming in the mist. The mirrors were tall, taller than any man, and they reflected strange and distorted versions of the world around them. Some showed Thomas with wings, others with his face twisted in fear. Some mirrors reflected nothing at all. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. What was this place? Why were the mirrors so different, so unsettling? The girl stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the mirrors. "This is the maze of truth," she said quietly. "Each mirror shows something different, something hidden deep inside you. But only by confronting those truths will you find your way out." Thomas hesitated, the weight of the mirror's reflections pressing on him. Each one seemed to show a different part of himself, a part he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But the girl's words echoed in his mind. "Only by confronting those truths will you find your way out." Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped forward into the maze, determined to face whatever lay within. The maze of mirrors was behind them now, but its effects lingered in Thomas's mind. He walked alongside the girl. He could still see flashes of the distorted reflections, the versions of himself that seemed so distant, yet so familiar. But the forest was not done with him yet. Their path wound deeper, the trees growing closer together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew heavier, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs. After a time, the forest opened up into a strange clearing. It wasn't like the other places Thomas had seen. The trees here were twisted, their bark dark and brittle. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, and the faint outline of a village could be seen in the distance. But this village wasn't like Everbrook. It was old, abandoned. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered, their doors hanging off their hinges. As Thomas stepped closer, a shiver ran down his spine. The village was eerily silent, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The girl beside him seemed unfazed, her expression distant as she gazed at the village with quiet understanding. "This place," she said, her voice soft, is not what it seems. The spectral figures of the villagers wandered aimlessly through the streets, their faces pale and hollow. They moved like shadows, as if they were not entirely there. Thomas could feel their sorrow, their longing, as if they were trapped in a world between life and death. He wanted to speak to them, to learn their stories, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply walked through the village, his heart heavy with empathy for those who had been lost to time. As they walked, Thomas noticed that the village seemed to shift and change, its buildings dissolving and reforming as if they were being pulled apart by an unseen force. He understood now that the village was not just abandoned, it had been forgotten, erased from the world in some way, and yet it existed here, in the forest, as a shadow of what once was. "Why are they here?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "They are memories," the girl replied, "memories of a time long past. The forest holds the stories of those who have come before, but they are not meant to be remembered forever. They linger, and then they fade." Thomas felt a pang of sorrow for the lost souls of the village. He wondered if he would someday join them, a memory lost to time. But for now, he had a purpose. He had to continue his journey. The journey from the forgotten village was long, the path winding deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees were dense, their trunks twisting like the fingers of some ancient hand, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. Thomas felt the weight of the journey pressing on him, but he could not stop. Now, he had come too far. Eventually, they reached a grassy hilltop, and there, standing before him, was the enchanted mirror. It rose up from the earth like a beacon, its silver frame gleaming in the soft light of the forest. But it was not alone. A creature stood before it, a guardian of sorts. It was large, its body covered in shimmering scales that caught the light and reflected it in 1,000 different directions. Its eyes were golden, piercing, and full of ancient wisdom. It gazed at Thomas with a sense of knowing, as though it had been waiting for him. "Who dares seek the mirror?" the creature asked in a voice that was deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. Its gaze was unwavering, and Thomas could feel its scrutiny, as though it were looking into the very depths of his soul. "I seek the truth," Thomas replied, his voice steady, despite the creature's imposing presence. "I wish to understand my heart." The creature studied him for a long moment, its golden eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Finally, it spoke. "Do you believe you are worthy to gaze into the mirror? Many have come before you, seeking answers, but not all have been ready to face the truth that lies within." Thomas took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come this far, and he would not turn back now. "I do not seek worthiness," he said firmly. "I seek the truth, nothing more." The creature nodded slowly, its scales shimmering in the light. "Then you may pass," it said, stepping aside to reveal the mirror. Thomas approached the enchanted mirror slowly, his heart beating faster with each step. As he stood before it, he saw not just his reflection, but something more. The mirror seemed to shimmer and pulse with light, and in its depths, Thomas saw visions of his family, his friends, and moments from his past. There were times of joy, his mother's gentle smile, his father's strong embrace, but there were also moments of pain, of fear, of uncertainty. He saw himself, standing alone in the forest, uncertain of his place in the world. He saw his heart's desires laid bare before him, his longing for adventure, for discovery, for something greater than the quiet life he had known in Everbrook. But he also saw the love he had for his family, for his village, for the people who had shaped him into who he was. As the images flickered and shifted before him, Thomas felt a deep sense of understanding wash over him. He was not just a boy seeking a mirror, he was a part of something much larger. His journey had not been about finding himself, but about embracing the truth of who he was and who he could become. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized that the mirror's magic was not in its ability to show him the future, but in its ability to reflect the truth of his heart. And that truth, he realized, was simple. He was loved, and he had a purpose. He was meant to return to Everbrook, to share the wisdom he had gained, and to live a life filled with love and purpose. From the mirror's shimmering light emerged a small crystal, warm and glowing with an inner energy. Ascends. Thomas reached out to take it, feeling its power hum in his hand. The crystal was small but incredibly strong, as though it held the very essence of the forest within it. The creature that had guarded the mirror watched him with approving eyes. "This is your truth," it said softly, its voice filled with ancient wisdom. "Protect it well, for it is the key to understanding the heart of the forest. It will guide you on your journey, and it will remind you of the lessons you have learned." He felt a deep sense of peace, as though he had found something he had been searching for all his life. The journey back was different from the journey forward. The forest, once dense and mysterious, now felt welcoming, as though it recognized Thomas's growth. The spectral villagers he had seen earlier in the forgotten village were now gone, their presence fading into the mist. The path seemed clearer, and the trees parted to allow him a straight route back to Everbrook. As Thomas retraced his steps, the crystal in his hand seemed to glow with a soft, steady light. It was as if the forest itself was guiding him home, offering him the strength to carry what he had learned with him. He could feel the magic of the forest in his bones, and he knew that he would never forget the lessons it had taught him. When Thomas finally returned to Everbrook, the village seemed unchanged, but he was different. He had seen the truth of his heart, and he was no longer the boy who had wandered into the forest seeking answers. He was a young man who had learned that the answers had always been inside him, waiting to be discovered. The villagers gathered around him as he shared his story, their faces filled with awe and wonder. His family embraced him, their love and warmth reminding him of his place in the world. The village square buzzed with excitement as lanterns flickered in the twilight, casting a soft glow on the faces of those he loved. That night, as Thomas sat in his room, the crystal glowing softly on his shelf, he felt at peace. The forest had shown him the way, and now he had found his place in the world. His heart was full, and he knew that whatever adventures lay ahead, he would face them with courage and love. As he drifted off to sleep, the soft glow of the lanterns outside flickered through the window, and he dreamed of the adventures yet to come.